This next session is arguably one of the most important we're going to hear during the entire conference. And we have two great speakers. You know the format by now. We're going to be joined on stage and we're going to hear two presentations. The first is from Michiel Buitelaar, the Chief Operating Officer of Sanoma Digital Media in the Netherlands. And the second is from Alessandro Belloni, the Chief Executive of D'Agostini Publishing in Italy. D'Agostini Publishing in Italy. And after that, it's questions. And if there was ever a time to use the hashtag AskFIPP method of asking questions, then surely it's in a social media session at the conference. So I'd encourage you, even if you've never tweeted before in your life, get out your smartphone, on silent of course, and start tweeting your questions and comments. So if our panel are ready, please welcome to the stage Michiel and Alessandro. Okay, so first up, I think, Michiel, you're first, in fact, so over to you.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me? Thank you for the very nice introduction and for raising the bar. Here I am, talking about social media. Let me find this. Social media in the context of magazines and magazine-related stuff is what I was planning to talk about. But of course, it's important to realize that these are some tentative views. I think that my company has done some interesting work. I think we've done a lot with social media in a broadest sense. We've made a lot of very interesting mistakes. Some of them I might share with you. My general view is that social media is quite often seen as just lots of people chatting away in a rather unstructured manner. I think social media has a lot to offer for most of you in various ways, which I will come up to. And you have to do it in a more professional way. That's at least our view from our company. I'm mainly observing about my own company, but you can do with it what you like. If you take it to a higher level, there is much more to gain for you, your brands, your advertisers, and other stuff. I'll come to that. Briefly on my background and of that of my company, we're the #1 magazine publisher in the Netherlands. We're also the #1 online publisher. We have an enormous amount of magazines and even bigger amount of websites, apps, and what have you. Some of the brands below played a role in my own life. Social, I think, is really difficult to define. If you look at this picture, you see some of the usual suspects, possibly even all of the usual suspects. But I'm also going to talk about other things like forums, communities, and blogs, things that also have a very clear social meaning, in my view. And I guess you recognize most, if not all of them, and I would predict that there will be even more over time. My personal view is that debates about social are very often seen or dominated by by Facebook, the Facebook thing. And I have nothing against Facebook, but there is much more. First this, the rear view mirror. This is something that McLuhan now and then uses. Let me use a word of caution. I think it's quite easy to look in the rearview mirror and to see new things in terms of the old. It's a quite common thing. For social media, it's really important to realize that some things are quite different. Actually, if you talk about Facebook, for instance, or Pinterest for that matter, as a site or even an app, I think they're generally not correct. I think you should look at these things as streams. Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, these are streams. And this is all about sharing, which is a slightly different approach than the standard magazine approach. I'll have some more examples about that. And then it's important to think in terms of different devices. There are very different devices which people use in different ways. And they also have a certain relationship. People very often start a certain task at one device and then finish it on another device. If you want to read more about that, I would recommend a recent study by Google, which has a very clear view on the role of different devices in different transactions. But my point is, don't look in a rear view mirror. There are some really new and different things about social media. I also think it's important to distinguish what sort of usage you can have with social media. Just using the term social media is a very broad thing, and I would recommend to at least distinguish content production, content distribution, branding of your own stuff, and branding for your customers, advertisers. And I think it's in the way that you deal with social media, it's important to distinguish these things and to differentiate the usage and to think about it in a different manner and possibly also use different KPIs. These four things, this is not a methodology, but again, I would suggest to at least distinguish. And of course, number one and number two, content production and distribution are pretty much related. But branding of your own stuff and branding of other people's stuff is really a different sort of goal. How do we think about social? Before this, we already had a couple of, let's say, econometrists. I'm not going to present too many data, but I will have some suggestions on a more quantitative approach. This is the first one. If you look at this picture, it clearly shows that most people, this is a research done under chief marketing officers in the US, published by Forbes, and it clearly shows that about half of them are not impressed, and only a very few part of those think that they can really, that they have really quantitatively, validated the usage of social media. And I would argue that generally, you know, if you ask people, how are you doing? I quite often get the answer, well, we have 20,000 likes. Not to be offensive, I think that's not a very impressive answer. That's not the level I think you should think about it. My recommendation is to dig much deeper. First example, this is about social and content production. This is a news service that we have in the Netherlands. It's quite big. And we have the news service, we have a forum called Nu Jij, which is Now You, and then we have something that takes images from the public. What we are quite happy with is the way in which we have opened the news for discussions, which gives us a view on how people like or not like the news, or how they are involved with the news. But it even brings us news. It brings us insights as to how people perceive the news. And then also, people themselves make photographs and put that on the new images, new photo. We have made some really interesting steps in integrating more social elements with this new service. That's an example of social and content production. Taking that further, we've taken a view that in producing this stuff, it's really about the combination of search, algorithms, and the journalists. For instance, we've had an automated Twitter track. I've been working with that for about half a year, really quite successful. And we have been using tools to optimize the texts, also doing A/B testing on different types, different parts of the community, testing how people like the texts. And if you take that further, then we tend to look at brands like Mashable and BuzzFeed. Especially, I think, BuzzFeed, I was quite impressed with. I've listened to the guy who set that up. And what his key statement was, you know, at a certain moment in time, we all started to produce content for search engine optimization, SEO. But what he did is really produced for sharing. And that is a typical thing about social. It's about making texts that people want to share. And that's also how then that content is being distributed. I think that's a very important part. Mashable uses a specific algorithm for that with a certain level of human curation. But it takes these things further, sharing as a distribution method. Next one, branding. Before I distinguished your own branding and the branding that you can facilitate for your customers. Branding, clearly, I think for magazines is a very important part to be present in the social space. I tend to think that editors themselves as persons could even be bigger. Bloggers are very important. We've done some really interesting things with bloggers. Brands becoming much more social is something that I think most magazines have already been working at and made some steps. That said, we've also been working with communities, setting that up. And that took quite a while, but if you look at the way that we're working with that now, social forums really require listening, which is a different approach than the conventional magazine approach. You're no longer fully in control, but it delivers a lot of interesting stuff. It's where your themes are being discussed. If you can manage that in this pyramid with the 1990. Have a look later on. It's a phenomenon, a pattern that we've seen in various communities, the 1%, the 9%, and the 90%, roughly. This is where you can have your own brand represented, but taking that further, it's also a platform to discuss stuff within the space of your own brands on behalf of advertisers. What we have been working with is what we call knowledge partners, which are, in a way, advertisers with whom we address certain themes and get them discussed in these forums. That is not a simple matter. It really requires a rather smart approach in moderating them, because, of course, the forum should be seen as honest, transparent, which, for instance, might require that you actually say this is a message that is being paid for by a certain advertiser, and the advertiser wants you to discuss it. To quite an extent, we have shown that it's possible, and we've actually taken that further. Since half a year or so, we now have been running test panels in which we actually, in these forums, suggest to the people participating in that to do tests on products paid for by the advertiser, which provides enormous amount of valuable market research. We've been quite happy with that, and we're doing that with some of our biggest magazine brands. Another thing of advertising for your customers that can take place in the atmosphere of blogs. The picture that you see here is Miss Lip Gloss. She is a 22-year-old who, in a way, did some things better than we did. She started working out of a cupboard and has made enormous steps in gaining an audience in the Netherlands. What we've seen, I think our company and several other companies in the beginning sort of poo-pooed this phenomenon. It wasn't taken seriously. It's not always as good as our own magazines, but it is highly authentic. It's very honest, and it very much appeals to people, and it very often operates in the really small parts of the long tail. What I've seen is that the L'Oréals and similar brands, 3 years ago, they didn't want to work with these bloggers. Nowadays they are, and they're in a way a competitor to us, but we've also been working with them. So we've been able to develop a mutually beneficial relationship between magazines and online assets and bloggers. Taking social further, this is not a real methodology, but I have some practical tips. It's really about setting your own scene, blogs, devices. Let me dig into that a bit further. This is the first one, setting your own scene. I already discussed communities, forums, and blogs. This is Viva, a really big magazine with a community in online that has become really, really big, in which we're running to share stuff, as I already discussed. Blogs, I mentioned Miss Lip Gloss, a phenomenon in the Netherlands, where there are many, many more young girls who often discuss very specific things. We feel that there's quite a benefit between those, let's say, very female themes and getting them in close to magazines and the other way around. We've also been watching blogging networks. We've actually also established one ourselves, Blog Today, and there are more and more of these things coming into play. Next one is devices. I briefly mentioned that different devices are used for really different things. Here's a couple of examples where you can use those devices. If you get to really nitty-gritty detail, you can use the devices for quite particular sort of usage. I have to watch my time, so I'm flicking through this. Open, very important. YouTube, you all know that, is, I think, the prime example of an open platform that you invite people to work with. Spotify playlists, but even Philips has now light bulbs that you can approach through APIs. Slightly weird, if you ask me, but it's an example of how you can involve people in your own community. Next one, important, KPIs. I already said that I think that social can be done in a more professional way. I'm not going into the depths of these KPIs. You can easily find them. These are quite feasible KPIs that you can fix without creating massive costs or needing tens of people. If you would use KPIs like these in the way that you deal with social in your company, I can promise you that you get a much more meaningful discussion, much more meaningful. And I've seen very few companies so far who use these. Next one is similar. It's also a matter of quantification. quantify sentiments. If you look at social, these are massive amounts of free data, real time, it's all available. This is an example of a company that did some work on Nike Fuel Band and got out of the talks that you can influence to a certain extent too, out of the talks on social networks on the Nike Fuel Band, got all sorts of data. There is an enormous amount of data to take from there. I'm not going to deal with it, but this, they just took out real time, online, in much more detail than I can show now about the Nike Fuel Band. It's just about tracking the discussions on Facebook, Twitter and other things, taking out the data and doing a quantification of that. And this, for instance, is a quantification, or at least the highest level map, of the followers of FIPP, in which you can distinguish the different clusters of people who discuss different topics. If you can see the word clouds on the right, these are the topics that are being discussed by 2 specific clusters in the FIPP community. Much more detail behind this, which you can find online if you want to. My point being quantification of stuff that you do with social, do your measurements and do analysis on it. There is much more to gain from that than most people realize. Last thing, get in social nerds. It's really important to facilitate people of a, who are really into all this stuff, give them space, let them act. These are different people than many of the people that you have in your company now. Let me put it like this, I would never believe someone of my own age. Get the others in. And let them experiment. And let also assume that some things might work and nothing will, or however you put it. It's really about finding your way, getting going. I have to wrap up. My point, which I hope I got across, is that running all this social stuff is really a craft that you should have the right people for, and which offers a potential that is very likely to be much bigger than what most of us get out of it today. Again, if you talk to someone who says, I'm so happy I have 20,000 likes, sorry to be so cynical, I think you're on the wrong path, or at least you're not there. There is much more to gain from that. And it's something you can use for your own brands, for the brands of your advertisers. You can do all sorts of content with it. You can find content and you can distribute it. And I would urge all of you to experiment and work with it. That's about it.